So we're going to start by having several presentations, followed by a question period and discussion, followed by a wrap-up and a prayer. I start by apologizing in advance for any mispronunciation during the call, either by myself or by anybody else who's making a presentation. All right, good afternoon to all our participants from the Netherlands, and good morning to all our participants from North America. So we're attending this video conference to review and discuss the liberation of Wergea and the area south of Leeuwarden, which occurred on or about April 15th, 1945, and to review and discuss the role of Lieutenant Arthur Frederick Harris of the 7th Reconnaissance Regiment, 17th Duke of York, Royal Canadian Hussars. The call is being held close to the 76th anniversary of the event, since it has finally been possible to make connection with some of the descendants of Lieutenant Arthur Frederick Harris. Members of the families of Lieutenant George Routley and Sergeant George Dunlop and George Klein are also in attendance today. Welcome to you all.
Thank you. In
April of every year, the Dutch people commemorate the liberation of their country, which occurred in 1945. Repeatedly, they've invited Canadian soldiers and their families to participate in these events. But in the event of Lieutenant Harris, this was never possible because of attempts to trace him were never successful. So this year, a set of circumstances combined to allow Arthur and his family to be traced successfully. First, the spark came from you, Edwin Meinsma, a young historian from the Netherlands who contacted the Royal Canadian Hussars Association looking for information. Second, a group of former Hussars, including Anthony Kellett, are writing a regimental history. We're in the process of reviewing the liberation. Third, due to the pandemic, several association members, including Randy Klein, John and Doreen Riley, Carl Cromell, Gordon Routley, and John Cochran, were delighted to help as it provided a diversion to their precautionary confinements related to the pandemic. Finally, due to the ever-accelerating developments of the internet, information is more readily available as it is in the past. As a result, 76 years after the event, it is finally possible to find Arthur's daughter, Patricia Harris Wensman, and through Patricia to the other members. So today, in lieu of a commemorative celebration, which would not in any case be attended due to restrictions associated with the pandemic, the Royal Canadian Hussars Association is sponsoring a video conference. We welcome from North America members of the Harris and other families, and those who participated in the research. From the Netherlands, we welcome His Honor the Mayor of Leeuwarden, historian Edwin Meinsma, and members of the Historical Society of Wergea. We also welcome the military attaché to the Dutch Embassy in Ottawa. We welcome you all, and we thank you for your interest and your participation. So now to proceed, I'm going to start by inviting our first speaker, Anthony Kellett. He's the co-author of the book entitled Montreal Cavalry, The History of the Royal Canadian Hussars, to make a presentation on the activities of the 7th Reconnaissance Regiment.
Thank you, John. Welcome to you all. I'm thankful for this opportunity to be able to talk about the regiment and its part in the liberation of the Netherlands. The regiment has been in continuous existence since 1812. It's been based in Montreal and the surrounding area all that time. For most of its history, it has been a part-time volunteer unit. For 80 years, from about 1880 to about 1960, there were two cavalry units in or near Montreal, the 6th Hussars and the 17th Hussars, and it's the 17th Hussars we'll be talking about today. The 17th Hussars became an armoured regiment in 1940 when it was mobilised and it got rid of its horses. The 17th Hussars arrived in Britain in September 1941 and 3 years training before landing in France in June and July 1944 by separate squadrons. The 7th Reconnaissance Regiment, which is what the 17th Hussars became in the war, began operating as a truly reconnaissance regiment around the 22nd of August and participated in a wild, rapid advance into Belgium. Members of the 7th Reconnaissance Regiment first entered the Netherlands in the Scheldt area in October 1944, and in November it moved into the Nijmegen area and wintered on the Waal. In mid-February 1945, the 7th Reconnaissance entered Germany on the west bank of the Rhine, and it finally crossed the Rhine at the end of March 1945. In early April, the 7th recrossed into the Netherlands and began the advance to Leeuwarden. I will now describe the 7th Reconnaissance Regiment at that time. At full strength, it consisted of 43 officers and 777 soldiers, a total of 820, all ranks. It was divided into regimental headquarters, headquarters squadron, and 3 fighting squadrons, A, B, and C. A fighting squadron consisted of 3 scout troops and an assault troop. A scout troop consisted of a reconnaissance section and 2 carrier sections. The personnel of a scout troop consisted of 2 lieutenants, 5 sergeants, and 32 corporals and troopers. The reconnaissance section comprised 2 Daimler armored cars and 2 Humber 3A light reconnaissance cars with very limited firepower. The carrier sections each comprised 3 Bren gun carriers with 3 men in each, and the carriers weighed 4 tons, could go 52 kilometers an hour, and carried just a Bren light machine gun. They were very vulnerable to mines and air bursts and grenades. Harris's troop would have been either number 5, number 6, or number 7 troop in the regiment. In each scout troop headquarters, there were 2 motorbikes, and these would have been the bikes that the philosophy of the commanding officer for much of this time was to hit the enemy first with all available firepower, and that, he believed, would reduce casualties. The reality is that the regiment killed or captured many thousands of Germans and had only 1 soldier captured. It was a great record. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much for the presentation on the unit. So let's go to Edwin. Edwin is the historian who started the questioning of who Lieutenant Harris was.
Yes. Thank you, John. Can you share my presentation, please?
Yes, I will.
Welcome to you all. I have prepared a short presentation in which I'm going to tell you something about the last days of the war in the region of Wergea from a Dutch perspective. Wergea is the village I was born in 1977, and the region is part of the province of Friesland, which is in the north of the Netherlands. And the names of the villages, as I mentioned before, are sometimes written in Dutch, but the official spelling is Frisian. So I will be using the Frisian names in my presentation. Before I start telling about how the liberation itself actually went, I would like you to understand the mood of the Dutch people in April 1945. So therefore, it probably makes sense to briefly mention some important facts that contributed to the deep desire for liberation in our region. The Netherlands were invaded in 1940 on May 10th by the German forces. They were forced to surrender after just 5 days. The German army was far better trained, had far better equipment, and certainly after they bombed one of our main cities, Rotterdam, by the German Air Force, and threatened to bomb some other cities as well, the Dutch government decided to surrender. And from that moment on, our country was occupied by the Germans. And people, of course, no longer lived in freedom. And as time went on, the Nazis took increasingly repressive measures, as we all know, particularly against Jews and other groups, and many of them were killed or died in camps. But they also forced a lot of young male adults, Dutch adults, to go to Germany, to deport them to Germany as forced laborers. Approximately 500,000 of them. In our part of the country, in Friesland, the image of bombers and fighters in the skies was very common because of the air war that was fought above our heads. The British bombers and the American bombers flew for a big part over our part of the country, and you can imagine that there was a lot of fighting going on in the skies, and also many of those planes crashed in Friesland. And then finally, in 1944, the Allies entered Dutch territory, and liberation comes closer. But it would take many more months to actually liberate the Netherlands as a whole. And the winter of 1945 was a very hard one, especially for the people in the center and in the west of our country. There were huge shortages of food, of basically everything and everywhere. And there was a huge famine, and many civilians died of that. Next slide, please. So this probably explains why the Dutch longed so much for the liberation. The misery was enormous, of course. But the Germans were not going to leave by themselves. So let's have a look at these German forces and defenses in our region. In the week before our village was liberated, some hundreds of German combat troops entered the area, especially in the villages south of Wergea, in the village of Jinsum. And as you can imagine, there grew huge tension among the population, among the civilians, because they, of course, feared that there would be fighting between the Canadians and the Germans. And these Germans were a mix of very young and some experienced soldiers. They were mostly poorly equipped, lightly armed, but they had one very powerful weapon, and that is the infamous Panzerfaust. It was a very easy to use but highly destructive rocket-propelled grenade. So even they were not that heavily armed, they still were very dangerous to Canadian forces. And they were preparing defenses at Jinsum. They were digging manholes, installing telephone lines, so preparing for battle. But fortunately, at April 12th, these soldiers left again for the Afsluitdijk, which is a dike between the north of the province of North Holland and Friesland. And this was a very important road for them, because this was the last route for retreating German forces, and they had to keep it open for them, so they could retreat to Germany. So fortunately, all these soldiers left again, and some of them were left behind, and these were the Sprengkommandos, that were demolition teams. They would stay behind in the region, and they had a very important task that we will see on the next slide. So for a while it looked there would be hard fighting between the Canadians and the Germans, but as I said, that fortunately did not happen. But what about the resistance? There were quite a few resistance fighters as well, and they were armed. So did they clash with the Germans? The resistance in our region was mobilized in the week before the Canadians were about to arrive. The Canadians were still some 100 kilometers south of our region, but the resistance was mobilized, and they were armed in 1944, 1945 with airdropped British weapons. And now they prepared to defend bridges against the Germans, so the Canadians could pass those bridges and frustrate the German retreat. And on the right side, you can see the resistance from my town Wergea, which was kept in reserve actually, because they expected that they would be needed in Leeuwarden to assist the local resistance in Leeuwarden to kick the Germans out if necessary. but they themselves were actually eager to capture and defend the Oudskou Bridge. And the Oudskou Bridge is the bridge between the villages of Imsum and Akrum, and is also the bridge where the Hussars finally arrived and could not go farther. We will see that on the next slide. But the resistance from Wergea eventually was not deployed, fortunately. And so there were hardly any confrontations between the resistance and the Germans. And then on April the 14th, the people from Akrum, Imsum, they heard sounds of fighting in the distance, and then they knew, well, the Canadians are coming. They're quite close. And that was also the moment, and I've told you, as I said before on the slide before, that there were some German demolition teams left in the area. And this was the moment that they started blowing up bridges, including the Oudskou Bridge. And these demolition teams left afterwards. And resistance, of course, was prepared, and they also knew that the Germans would do this. And they had made plans to repair those bridges. They had prepared some barges loaded with wood. So at the moment that the Canadians would arrive, they would be able to repair the bridges and let the Canadians keep advancing. So the bridges were blown, including the Oudskou Bridge between Akrum and Jinsel. And it was clear now that the Canadians could arrive any moment. And that finally happened on April 15th at 11:30 to be exactly in the morning, when B Squadron of 7th Reconnaissance Regiment arrived from actually two directions, from the direction of Terhorne in the left lower corner, and a direction from Oldeboren, is in, let's say, the lower right corner. The yellow route marks the route of Sergeant George Dunlop, the motorcycle patrol, and in red you can see the route that Arthur Harris took with his men. He arrived from Oldeboren, Akrum, then arrived finally at the bridge that was blown, together with Sergeant Dunlop. And after they saw that the bridge was not there anymore, they planned actually to retreat to Joude, which is in the south, and wait for the Royal Canadian Engineers to arrive and build a Bailey Bridge. But the resistance, as I said before, they had prepared some barges with wood, and they convinced the Canadians that they could build an emergency bridge the same day, and that made the Canadians decide to wait for the bridge to be built, and in the meantime find another route north to Leeuwarden. And that is exactly what Dunlop and Harris did. Dunlop crossed the remains of the bridge in the canal. He was with some soldiers and motorcycles, but with a couple of small boats, they managed to cross the canal and move northwards. And Harris took another route. He went back to Akrum and then found a way north to Grauw. And there, when he arrived there, the civilians helped him, and his grain carriers were loaded on civilian boats in the village of Grauw. And there they sailed to my town, Wergea, which is in the north. In the extreme upper part of the picture, you see Wergea. That is the village of Wergea. And they arrived there at 1500 hours in the afternoon. So on May the 5th, the German forces in the Netherlands and northern Germany finally surrendered, and the Dutch were of course very happy with what the Canadians had done. And from that moment on, a special bond was forged. One important reason for that was that the Canadian forces remained a long time in the Netherlands. The last troops left in November 1945. So you can imagine that some relationships and marriages and friendships were formed. my own grandparents had met some Canadian soldiers and nurses in the war during the liberation and the weeks after, and they corresponded with them for several years. So there was a connection, and the gratitude towards Canada never faded. In the special years in the 80s, 85, 90, 95, all witnessed big celebrations, and hundreds of veterans visited the Netherlands, often as special guests. So there was the gratitude was expressed again in those celebrations. And of course, unfortunately, many Canadians also died in our country, and they were buried in special Canadian War cemeteries, 3 of them, in Holten, Bergen op Zoom and Groesbeek. And these graves are always have been taken care of course, by the Commonwealth Grave Association, but also by the civilians. On the right, you see a picture of a schoolgirl taking care of the graves. So also new generations adopt the graves and take care of them. April 15th is in our province the annual commemoration of the liberation, and May the 5th is the National Liberation Day. So, next slide, please. So, thank you very much for your attention. Although it was a short presentation, I hope you have an idea of how the Dutch experienced the last days of the war in this region. And I would like now to move on to the next item on the agenda. We are very pleased that the mayor of the municipality of Leeuwarden, Mr. Sibrand Buma, accepted our invitation, and that you would like to say a few words to us. So, Mr. Buma, thank you very much for that. And I would now like to give you the floor. So please go ahead.
Yes. Fine. Very welcome from me on behalf of the municipality of Leeuwarden. I'm honored to speak to you, albeit from home, and speak to you in very different time zones of this world. And under better circumstances, I'm sure that we really certainly would have seen each other in person. On the other hand, the digital connection does bring us closer wherever in the world we are. So maybe as a result of the situation we are in, we rather see each other more frequent in the future than less frequent. Yeah. As Edwin mentioned, liberation of Friesland by Canadian troops occurred in April 1945, and I can assure you that it is engraved in our memory, in our collective memory. This year, as every year, I will lay a wreath on the 15th of April at a plaque which is vested on the town hall wall, commemorating the liberation by Canadian troops of Leeuwarden. Of course, this year, like last year, without people, without an audience, but I'm sure we will come back to that, and hopefully we can invite you as guests another year. Numerous Canadians risked their lives, who we're talking about, and all too many lost their lives. And so far from home, I always realize it was not their country, it was a country they perhaps had never known before, and a part of the country they had never known before. But it's very important to keep telling the story in all sides, on both sides of the ocean. Because I realize that every year, fewer eyewitnesses remain. So it is our duty to tell the story, and to keep the flame burning of freedom and the realization that freedom doesn't come for free, that people lost their lives, and that we always have to realize that living in freedom is a gift, but something we have to cherish. And sometimes this liberation comes close at once. Last year, my father passed away, and he was 88, and he was a boy during the liberation time. He was 13. And when I went through his papers, I found a very difficultly readable paper. I think about the last empty papers he had, written with a pencil, an eyewitness report of the last days of the occupation and the liberation by the Canadians. He lived in Sneek, a town about 25 kilometers from Leeuwarden. It was a family that was hurt. His father had died during the war as in a German concentration camp, but he knew that now peace was coming. And he writes, and that's what I find so interesting, he writes that 5 years earlier, they lived on the main road. When his father still lived, the Germans came in. First, the Dutch troops passed the house, leaving, and then the Germans came. And his father ordered the curtains to be closed. They weren't allowed to watch. And now 5 years later, he goes onto the street and he first sees, as he describes it, a funeral procession of Germans leaving the country. And then at the end of his eyewitness report, he sees the tanks coming in. And then he knows he's liberated. And they waved the flag and they kept it waving for 2 weeks. That was when they were liberated. And now my father died, and I realized that all his life, he has carried the burden of these 5 years. But he has also, and I think that counts for all the Frisians, all their life been grateful to the liberators. Because he was a mayor as well as I am, he had the opportunity to go to Canada, to the Perth Regiment, which liberated Sneek. And the Perth Regiment went to Sneek. And I can assure you that not only for the veterans, but also for the people who were liberated, it is of major importance that these connections stay. They stayed during his life, all his life, and I think, and I would like to finish with that, it's our obligation to continue that. So you are welcome when you are in round, you're always welcome in Leeuwarden, because we know how important the bond between Friesland and Canada is. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bruma. We very much appreciate it. And Edwin as well, we thank you very much for your presentation.